Well, on that note, I guess we should start now, if you're ready.
That's bonus material for nobody, because I'm not leaving this in.
For our Patreon.
For our Patreon would suck if our episodes were unedited episodes. It would be like, oh, I can see why they cut this out. Why am I paying more for this?
Oh my god, can you imagine? We'd get no money for a Patreon. It'd be like, don't subscribe to them, they suck.
Negative money. They would take money from us.
Oh my god.
Okay. Hello and welcome to MASHmouth, a podcast covering every single episode of the hit 1970s sitcom, MASH. I'm Ethan.
And I'm Vanessa.
Hello, Vanessa. Before we started recording, I was telling you about how in this cartoon that I like, just RuPaul is just randomly a guest star voice as the villain of the week. And his character had nothing to do with being RuPaul, like nothing to do with drag. He was like an alien investigator. And I thought that was like bizarre casting where you're like, why is he this character? So I wanted to talk to you about like what's your favorite like weird guest star that showed up, or favorite just general guest star that showed up in a TV show. You were like, why is he here?
Well, I don't know if it's like necessarily why is he here, but one of my favorite guest star roles was Robin Williams in SVU. He played like the creepiest guy and he did it so well. And SVU is a great show and it has had many, many famous people, but Robin Williams was like really famous when he was on SVU. And usually SVU has stars before they're famous. So it was kind of weird to see, like, why is Robin Williams here? And he was so creepy and so
awesome.
Gross. Like, he was really, really good in the episode, but it also, like, didn't make sense for him to be on.
That's awesome. I didn't know that's what you were going to talk about. I thought you'd bring up, like, a sitcom. No, SVU has, like, these wild guest stars for their villain of the week. Like, I've seen clips of, like, Chevy Chase was on it as, like, you know, a not good man. But I didn't know Robin Williams was there, too. That's awesome. And Robin Williams can do, like, really villainous. Like, have you ever seen Insomnia or 1 Hour Photo? He can do, like, those villain roles really well.
Yeah, he was really good in it, and I was so surprised that he played creepy so well because I hadn't seen any of those creepy movies that he's been in. And yeah, the other one that I was thinking of was, she's like a little bit less well known, but Amber Gray from Hadestown, who plays Persephone, she was also on SVU. And yeah, so just everyone that I love is on SVU apparently. So it's a lot of fun.
At some point, you take a stint as either a victim or a victimizer on SVU.
Yeah, literally, like almost anyone that you can think of was probably on a Law and Order franchise.
I would say, other than like random people doing like voiceover work, because it's easier to get people to do voiceover work for cartoons where you're like, hey, come on, do a whatever. It's only an hour of work. Come on, RuPaul, you want to be Agent Mulder for an episode? Why not? I would have to say, you know, Werner Herzog, the documentary filmmaker, this old German man, like very thick accent, bald. He's like kind of scary looking and is this very high profile documentary filmmaker. For some reason, he's just in one scene of Parks and Recreation. Just like he hangs out and he's like, hello, I was living underneath the floorboards. Like of this like creepy house. And that's probably my favorite random guest star role of you're like, wait a second, why is he here? Like I said in the beginning. Otherwise, maybe, you know, good old Lin-Manuel Miranda's stint on House.
Oh, that
for
was
like a few
so
episodes.
Fun. That was so good. He played like I loved that character too. He was so cute in that role. I loved it.
That was like pre-Hamilton, but like post In the Heights. So you're like, oh, he's like known, but he's not like the king of the world yet.
Yeah.
I love guest stars, man. I want to be a guest star someday. I wanted somebody to be like, oh my god, it's him, when they're watching just a random show.
That would be fun. Like, honestly, to have some kind of recognition, like, oh my god, that's Ethan.
So Vanessa, What was this episode about? Let's get into it.
So in this episode, someone seems to be out to get Henry when a series of dangerous mishaps start occurring. But as it turns out, we learn that it's actually not Hawkeye and Trapper up to their usual practical jokes. It's a soldier who is really desperate to get back stateside and back home to see his girl. So this was an episode.
So this episode is called The Cowboy, and our mystery kind of villain of the week turns out to be this guy who like works with the MASH unit to bring like wounded soldiers in. And right at the beginning, one thing that stood out to me was that he comes in like flying down in a helicopter, and the helicopter lands and he steps out, and there's just like his shoulder is like super bloody, like where he's been shot. And that stood out to me because I know this show kind of pushed boundaries and will continue to do that later on. But it was still kind of surprising to see that kind of blood in this time period. Did you have any thoughts on that?
So I know that in the beginning, the show or the network actually, I don't think they wanted blood in the show at all. And the showrunners were like, this is about doctors in a MASH unit in the Korean War. There is no way that we can do this show without blood. So the show did kind of push the boundaries of what was acceptable to show in like blood-wise, like gore-wise. Even though I don't particularly think the show was that gory, I think for the time period though, it was like, wow, that's a lot of blood. Like that's real.
Yeah, like it was kind of thick red on his shoulder, and that's like what stood out to me of like, oh, he's not just bleeding, he's bleeding out. And there's a difference with that, and just the fact that he fully collapsed on the ground, it was kind of surprising to see. Not that it was played very dramatically, but it was more than I was anticipating from this show this early on. It was just one of the things that stood out to me. Maybe one of the few things that stood out in this episode, because you don't have a lot of thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I watched it very passively because I didn't usually when we record, I watch the episode once and then I watch it again for notes, and I didn't really need to this time, I felt, because I didn't really have much to say. I don't dislike this episode for sure. I don't remember this episode all that much when I think about like watching MASH the first time when I was younger, but I definitely don't think that anything really stood out to me that much in this episode. It's not a favorite, but not for like any bad reason, just because it's just very generic, I feel.
I like this one, actually. Maybe it wasn't a favorite, but I did like the kind of mystery that it developed, even though because it opens with this cowboy and we kind of get to know him, that he's this guy with a big mustache and like everybody's super familiar with him, and he wants Hawkeye to be like, hey, my shoulder's wounded, is there any chance that we could spin this into getting home? And Henry's like, no, I'm not gonna, that's nothing, everybody has something back home, you're just gonna have to deal with it. And then that's kind of forgotten about as they do other things, and then just suddenly Henry is like attacked from various angles, and it's kind of a mystery as to who's doing it, because at first you're like, oh, is it Hawkeye and Trapper being like goofballs and trying to scheme a thing? But then as it goes on, you're like, oh wait, what's happening is actually dangerous, so like, what do we do here? And obviously you know it's gonna be Cowboy Man, because he's the only one who showed up in the episode otherwise, but you know, I did like how it played out.
Not that it was like anything, like the structure was anything like really different, but I did feel like the kind of mystery of it was pretty interesting. That's not something that you get typically with the episodes. So I did think that was pretty fun. Yeah, like you said, like the dramatic irony is that you kind of know that it's Cowboy and not Hawkeye and Trapper, even though that's kind of how they're setting it up to be within the characters, which was funny. Like, I thought that played for laughs really well when Henry came in. So one of the things that happened was a Jeep ran through Henry's tent, and previously before that, Trapper was trying to take that same Jeep on to take a nurse on a date, and Henry was like, no, you're not allowed to do that. And so Henry thought that it was Trapper who like ran the Jeep through the tent to get back at him. And he was just like, where were you? Like, what were you doing? Where's here? Like that kind of thing. That was funny.
No, it was funny. When Henry explains to them that like, oh, a Jeep ran through and I think it's you guys because like that's the kind of thing you do. And they're like, how dare you think so low of us? We're not. What Hawkeye says is, Trapper may be crazy, but he's not insane. Or no, he says, Trapper may be insane, but he's not crazy. Like, yeah, they're pranksters and malicious, but they're not going to endanger your life, Henry. And how they played that was like pretty good, because that was the second incident of something dangerous happening. The first was like they were golfing and the golf ball gets shot. And the way they react, Trapper and Hawkeye, was like very subdued to where you're like, oh, is this Hawkeye trying to be like, all right, I'm gonna get this cowboy a vacation. We're gonna shoot a golf ball. We're gonna freak Henry out. We're gonna get him to go home. But then, you know, it goes on and you're like, oh, wait a second. Things are unraveling. It's not our boys. Who's doing it? Oh, wait, it's the cowboy guy. What?
Yeah, I thought that again, it's not really hijinks because it was kind of dangerous stunts. Like when Henry was, so to back up a little bit, Henry, when all these events started happening, Hawkeye and Trapper were like, you should leave for Seoul for a couple of days to like get out of the camp and just whatever. So then of course Frank has to be in charge again. So when Henry is like instructing Frank on what to do when he's gone, he is like opening up the drawers, like really nervous that they're gonna like something's gonna pop out or something's gonna happen. And then he throws something on his chair after his whole like monologue, and the chair just explodes. Yeah, and it's just like, oh my goodness, what's happening here? It was like all these things are so funny.
How did he even rig a chair to explode like that? Because it was just like a pop.
To go forward a little bit, Hawkeye and Trapper kind of realize that it's Cowboy, and they go into his stuff, and they realize that like he has dynamite and like guns and whatnot, and it's just like, wow,
he has like a legit stick of dynamite.
Yeah,
it was like very goofy. Just the fact that they pull out this like cartoon stick of dynamite, which I refuse to believe. I know it is a real thing that people do use, but I refuse to believe that dynamite is real. Nobody's ever used dynamite to do anything. It's all like a C4 charge these days. Am I right?
It's funny though, because like, of course they pull out this like pack of dynamite, and it's like, no, like this wouldn't be here. That's like so dangerous. It's like, that's so ridiculous.
In the very beginning, when Hawkeye is taking care of Cowboy in the hospital, this character just has a 6-shooter on him, and he's like waving it around and just like, yeehaw, my brothers. And you're like, he shouldn't have that.
Oh my god, yeah, no, exactly. He's literally just like waving this gun around, just like playing with the chamber and stuff like that. I'm not a gun person, I don't even know, but he's like, it's just so obvious that it's so dangerous, and it wouldn't be allowed otherwise, except for like the context of the episode.
And I wonder if him being the villain was more of a twist in the 70s, because cowboys were so much more regularly hero figures back then, that having a cowboy character turn out to be a bad guy, I wonder if that was like, whoa! Or if everyone was still like, well, he's the only one who showed up in this episode, so he must be the assassin.
Yeah, I'm assuming that it was like obvious, because I know that we say on this show like, oh, the 1970s this, and like sitcoms up until then were really like pure and this and that and the other thing, but like people weren't necessarily dumb in the
dummies.
70s. Yeah, exactly. Like sitcoms followed a certain, and they still do, they follow a certain like script basically, and it's supposed to be like, that this dumb thing is happening with this character. So yeah, no, I know what you're saying though, like, oh, was this something that people just didn't know? But probably not.
It's like there was a line in this episode when Hawkeye is like trying to tell Henry like, oh, we should like cowboy guy go home, and it's like one of those clever lines that MASH does. Hawkeye responds, "Are you saying no?" And Henry responds, no, I'm saying goodbye, but it's multiple choice. You can pick your favorite. It's delivered more cleverly than I said it, but it was one of those lines where it reminded me a lot of like Tarantino kind of Aaron Sorkin, Amy Sherman Palladino, like really those clever guys where it's like, oh, look at my dialogue, it's so clever. And like people will talk about that kind of dialogue like Tarantino or Aaron Sorkin invented that. But you watch this show and you're like, oh wait, no, they've had clever dialogue forever. It's just, it wasn't invented in the 90s.
Yeah, definitely. In this episode, Henry was not like super mean, but he was definitely like a commanding officer more in this episode. Even though he still retained that like funny, like Henry-esque about him, he was very like, no, Cowboy's not going home because he has something going on at home. Like Hawkeye was trying to like really be empathetic and send him home. And Henry was like, no, he's fine. No, we're not doing that. And he was like kind of a hard ass in this episode. And it was
a little bit
almost out of character. But Henry does have throughout the episodes and the seasons that he's in, he does have from time to time, like a commanding officer presence when he needs it. And it was just kind of strange to see because it was I think this was the first episode where he like really showed it.
Wasn't just going along like, oh yeah, you guys do whatever.
Yeah, and he even said, I think he what did he say? Oh, when Frank was when Frank was taking over as commanding officer for a few days when Henry was away, Frank was like, I'll have this unit back into shape in no time. And Henry's like, who said it was out of shape? Like, you know.
One thing that stood out to me when they're in the mess tent, like having lunch, and first of all, nobody's talking to Henry because they think like he's just gonna get shot at any moment or something. So they're all scared for his life or their life. Henry gets these like pork chops especially made for them, and Hawkeye and Trapper like sit down next to him and like have a legitimate conversation with him. And Trapper like takes his food and is like, oh, I have to make sure it's not poisoned, and he just literally eats his entire meal in front of him and gives him back the plate. And that was the one thing where I was like, that's mean. Like, you didn't have to do that. You're just being mean if you eat somebody else's whole lunch.
That was so funny to me as well, because like it was a very like throwaway thing, but it was one of the things that I was thinking about in the episode. I was just like, that's like an old sitcom thing, I feel.
Yeah.
Like it might be a new sitcom thing too, where it's just like this dumb thing like that happens, but I don't know, like for some reason I was just like, the 70s.
It's a very old style gag where you're like, oh, the funniest thing in the world is going to be us revealing that a plate is empty.
Yeah, exactly. Like I can't exactly explain it, but if you're an old sitcom connoisseur, you might know what I'm talking about. But yeah, it was just like, wow, that's so 1970s humor. I love it.
Okay. So, this episode, I think, had a really interesting and kind of not thrilling, but kind of intense climax. Henry does get on, like, the helicopter with this cowboy before he realizes that he's the one trying to kill him. And they go up in the helicopter together, and Trapper and Hawkeye realize, like, oh no, Henry's in danger, we have to contact him. And it is kind of tense. I thought it was like bizarrely tense for this episode. What did you think of it?
Yeah, it was really tense. There was no laugh track. It wasn't really played as funny. This to me was like, it was the most intense part of the episode. It was also for me the most interesting part of the episode because, so throughout, Cowboy wants to go home because he's afraid that his wife or girlfriend or whoever she is like missing him. Yeah. So he's afraid that his wife is like missing him to the point where she is like gonna like leave him or cheat on him or something like that. So in this part of the episode, Radar comes in with this letter from his wife, and it says from his wife Jean in Reno. And you know, Reno was one of those places where people like run away to get a quick divorce and then quickly married. And
oh really? Okay, yeah. So I didn't get the Reno joke. I was like, Reno is for me, Reno 911, that like weird cop show. Like, for me, that's what, like, Reno is. It's, like, a weird place where, like, weird comedy hijinks happen. So I thought, like, they were like, oh, no, Reno. Like, he's from Reno. He's crazy. He'll do whatever. So I didn't get the Reno joke.
Yeah, so Reno is, like, I don't know if it's still a thing. You know how people, like, go to Las Vegas to get married really quickly? Like, Elvis marries them and, like, all that kind of crazy stuff.
Yeah.
That's, like, what Reno is. That's kind of what they were playing at. Like, oh, and then he says, like, oh, I'm from Reno. So they're like, whew, okay, good. And then it starts out with a Dear John, like it says Dear John, the letter. And they're like, oh no, it's a Dear John letter. This, like, maybe for our listeners who don't know, but a Dear John letter is a letter that, like, girlfriends or wives would send to soldiers who are at war saying, like, yeah, I'm not waiting for you. I'm moving on. You've been gone for too long. Goodbye.
And, it was a Nicholas Sparks movie. Everybody knows that.
So, and then they were like, oh no, it's a Dear John letter. And then he's like, no, my real name's John. And it was played as this really funny thing. And so as they're reading it, they're like, oh no, like, this is going to be it. This is what he was so nervous about, is that his wife is going to leave him. And they're like, that's it. Like, Henry's dead because this guy's going to go crazy. And so as they're reading it, she's saying, I was tempted to basically, like, cheat on you. They didn't say it in all those words, but that's what they were implying. And then she ends the letter saying, I didn't cheat on you, basically. And I'm still, like, worthy of your love and, like, all that kind of stuff. So in this moment, like, it's so intense because you're cutting between Henry up there in the helicopter, like, oh my God, I'm gonna die, and Hawkeye and Trapper reading this letter, like, oh no, Henry's gonna die. And then it turns out okay in the end, thankfully.
No, that letter was insane because it's the kind of letter that only makes sense if you're reading it line by line for comedic effect, because she was basically saying, I did lose my way. She literally puts, like, so this is a Dear John, and Radar, who's, like, with Hawkeye and Trapper when they're reading this, takes off his hat, bows his head, and he's like, oh dear God, it's a double Dear John letter. And then, like, in the last sentence, she's like, never mind, I didn't, it's all good. And we're like, okay, phew, Henry's not gonna crash into the land below or whatever this guy was planning to do.
Yeah, it was really intense too, because, like, before that, like, when Henry realizes that it's Cowboy that was trying to, like, kill him, basically. He was saying, what did he say? It was really funny. He was like, oh, shouldn't I have a parachute too? Because Cowboy had this parachute on when he was, piloting the helicopter, and he's like, no, like, you're not gonna need one, or whatever he said. So I guess he was, like, just planning to jump out of the helicopter and leave Henry there to crash, which is, like, so ominous.
Insane.
Yeah, it's, like, really crazy.
And not to spoil anything.
No, don't say it. We're not talking about it.
Okay.
Anyway.
No 50-year-old spoilers here.
Yeah, no.
Okay, I'll cut that out.
You don't have to. You could keep it in that I'm yelling at you.
It was this sense of dread because you're like, oh goodness, is Henry, no, this episode, I thought this episode was pretty good.
Yeah, talking about it more, it was funny. It was like, this episode kind of showed for me that MASH was still trying to find its footing. I do forget that this is the first season because, like I said, I've watched this show so many times, and even though I haven't seen this episode multiple times, I'm still so used to these characters and used to MASH that watching it episodically like it is, I'm like, oh wow, okay, like this is why the show almost got canceled in the first season, because you didn't have these, like, really great episodes back to back.
Yeah. With this climax, why it was so kind of tense was obviously when the actors are in the helicopter, you can imagine, like, they're just in front of, like, a blue screen to be the sky, right? But there are shots of just the helicopter in the air with these two men, like, fighting each other, and I don't know how they did this, if it was, like, just on wires or something, but seeing this helicopter up in the air with these two men struggling, it was like, no, that's legitimately dangerous. Stop. You're gonna hurt yourselves. Helicopters are scary.
I'm really curious as to whether it was, like, I can't imagine. Well, obviously, like, I would hope that the actors were not, in any kind of danger, but it really looked like they were up in the air. Like, it didn't look like a green screen or anything like that. So I really am wondering, like, how, if they were suspended in the air, like, that's so scary. It was so, like, real and intense.
That's the thing about watching anything, because even TV shows nowadays have such, like, CGI special effects where, like, everything's computer, everything's on a green screen, everything's fine. But, like, when you watch old stuff like this, and it is all practical and, like, done on set, where you're like, all right, that looks convincing. Are they really putting themselves in danger by doing this? And it's the kind of thing you can only get with these older things, where you're like, I know they didn't have the technology to fake this all the way, so seeing these dangerous moments is even more dangerous, because you're like, oh goodness, are they gonna get hurt?
I think that this is one of the things where MASH really benefits from not being on a soundstage, because you can't really do this kind of bit on a soundstage at all. I don't know. I just think it's really great that it was like in the actual like wild, basically. I thought that was really cool. So I have a piece of trivia, a little bit of trivia from this episode. There wasn't much, but it was pretty interesting still. So in this episode, Cowboy is played by an actor named Billy Green Bush, and he mostly
That's a good name.
Yeah, I know,
That's a
right?
cowboy name if I ever heard one. That's like Mad Dog Morgan.
It was funny because he mostly did like cowboy American, like all-American guy kind of guest roles. He didn't have like a really extensive acting career, but he guest starred in a lot of roles. On his Wikipedia page, his biggest role for television was a recurring character in Hill Street Blues, which I've never even heard of.
I think it was a cop show.
I'm pretty sure, yeah. And then also something fun, not about him, but about his daughters. His twin daughters played the character Carrie on Little House on the Prairie, like the little sister. And that was the show that was on before MASH that I would always watch as a kid. That's how I got into MASH. So I think that that's like funny full circle kind of thing.
When we first talked about MASH, in the 1-2 text message punch, I was like, hey, have you ever seen MASH? And like in the same sentence, you're like, oh man, I love MASH. I love Little House on the Prairie. So these two are connected for you. That is funny.
It's so crazy. Like every time I think about MASH, I think about Little House on the Prairie, and they're two completely different shows. And it's just like the wildest thing. But yeah, so that's a little bit about him. And then, so I thought this was really interesting too, and I don't agree with it. This episode is the only episode from season 1 that TV Guide listed as a classic episode, like one of the classic MASH episodes. And I just so disagree with that, like completely disagree, because there are so many like more, there's an iconic scene in an episode coming up, and I feel like that is more of a classic MASH episode, and I don't really see how this was considered classic MASH, but that's just me, I guess.
What we've seen, Yankee Doodle Doctor, I think, is like a defining MASH episode for me, where it's like, I can't imagine the show without that kind of episode. Like, Yankee Doodle Doctor's important, so I am surprised too. Not that this episode is bad or anything, but I don't know if I'd call it an all-time classic.
Yeah, me neither. I don't know. It's just whatever, TV Guide. Okay, fine.
Who needs you anymore? Are you in print? Who cares about you, TV Guide? Everybody just has the internet now. So take that, you goofball. So, Vanessa, our dear friend Jacob, who helps with this show, sent us in a little review of this episode.
Ooh.
Hey, Ethan and Vanessa, this is your technical consultant writing to say, turns out I watched this episode of MASH before you two could, and I decided to write a review for it. It is pretty funny. Cowboy is wounded but can't get back to the States. Then Henry becomes the target of a bomber that we never see, resulting in some initially scary stuff, but it turns funny later on. I wasn't too interested in Cowboy's arc, but I did enjoy Henry's, where the attacks are sudden and it's not obvious who the bomber is. It's played out in a way that really suits the show's mood. Hope you two enjoy.
And if any of our listeners would like to send in their review of the episodes that we're going to be covering, you can do so by contacting the show at the various links below.
Yeah! So Vanessa, do you have any final thoughts on the episode as we start to wrap up here?
Like I said, this was just kind of one of those like episodes. It just happened. For me, it was very like, okay. I laughed. unlike TV Guide, I don't think that this was a really like iconic, very like classic MASH episode. It had some like MASH moments. It didn't stand out in my mind, I don't think.
I would agree with that. I think the helicopter climax and the kind of mystery of the episode did keep me pretty engaged with it. I liked it, but unlike you, I haven't seen the show all the way through 5 times. So as I watch it, I'm just like, oh, this is pretty good, without the basis for like what a really good episode is. Because we've had some good episodes, but I don't know if we've had that 10 out of 10 classic one yet. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. I would say this is a hot take, but I don't think that the episodes get like really 10 out of 10 really good until like season 4 or 5. But that's just me.
And that's like 100 episodes from now. See you in 2 years, BJ. I don't know who you are yet. I haven't seen any of your episodes. So we'd just like to give thanks to Vanessa's sister, Melissa, for our awesome cover art, Jacob Fiarbalco for being our technical consultant, as well as sending in a nice little review. Links to where you can contact the show and our music are in the description. And lastly, we'd like to thank you, our listeners. Until next time, remember to check your chair for dynamite, because there might be some under there. Goodbye, farewell, and amen.
Bye, everyone.